So I'm Mark Weber of the Computer History Museum, and I'm here on February 21st with 2024 with Cindy Cohn, Director of EFF. And thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you.
So from your perspective, thinking of legal and civil liberties, could you help the general public visitor understand the issue of explainability with today's chatbots?
Well, I think everybody wants to know why they're getting the information they're getting. And with these chatbots, often it's pretty difficult to tell why you're getting the information that you're getting. And that can be really critical in helping you evaluate whether you should trust what you're hearing or not. Most people have played around with some of these chatbots and gotten gibberish out of them, but sometimes you can't tell. So explainability is a way that the system is telling you how it got to the answer it got. And that ought to be one of the kind of basic things that we expect from any of these systems if they're going to be making decisions about us.
Excellent. And what about their production of falsehoods stated with conviction?
Yeah, I think that's something we're all going to have to learn as a society, that the fact that something is well said doesn't mean that it's right. And we kind of have always known that for a while, but sometimes we think the fact that something is said with complete authority makes it more trustworthy, and I suspect our children aren't going to think that. Because these systems can sound very, very trustworthy while not being trustworthy. And that's always going to be the case. We can work to make them better and make that happen less often. But in terms of the way a lot of these neural networks work right now, they don't know whether they're right or not. They only can predict whether the thing that they're saying often comes after the thing that was said before. And that's not the same thing as knowing whether things are right or not. So we are going to have to learn and get our, senses ready to evaluate these kinds of things. They call them hallucinations. I don't think that's really right. They're just wrong. Hallucination makes you think that there is a brain in there and it's just messed up right now. That's misunderstanding how most of these systems work. They are just predicting what word or what phrase or what idea comes next based upon a set of other materials that they have digested. So that means they don't have any intelligence to know whether what they're saying is true or not. And that's probably going to be the case for a while, and maybe forever, but there might be new technologies that can help counter that. But I think in the short term, we're going to need the humans to develop a little better sense of thinking about whether something is right or wrong and doing independent kind of work to try to check it out rather than just relying on what the computer says.
And how about some of the problematic, making dangerous suggestions, bias and bigotry in their output? Any particular?
I think that's going to continue. Again, I think there are people who are trying to, the whole science of alignment and other things are trying to help these systems have guardrails on them against that. But I think we're a long way from being able to feel like that's a solved problem. There are some things, say, in the context of facial recognition. There's a lot of concern about bias against darker colored skin. Facial recognition systems are AI machine learning systems. That there are ways that you can mitigate that, but I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it entirely. And so we always have to be on the lookout for those kinds of things. That's why transparency, explainability, and those kinds of things are a good first step towards trying to at least get a handle on bias and also give people a way to recognize when it's happening. But they're not going to solve the whole problem either.
And talking about sort of current uses, it seems to me that there's places they're being used that are similar to older machine learning, basic computing, and places that they're really new questions. So like the new one would be, strikes me as, can you copyright something done by a chatbot? That was simply not an issue with most older technology.
Yeah, I think people weren't looking to copyright the information. I think it's unlikely, and let's put it this way. I don't think that I don't think that the output of most chatbots in most situations should be copyrighted. Now, there are people who are doing art with generative AI where they really are controlling something and they're using the system as a tool. But there, I think the copyright goes to the artist, not to the system. You wouldn't put the copyright in, something that Microsoft Word does in the word processor. I think that that's a good starter frame to think about how generative AI works. My friend calls it spicy autocomplete. But it's doing more than just that. But I don't think it's a difference in kind, such that we should start imbuing rights to the system. That doesn't mean there might not be some rights for the person who is actually using the system to create something.
And right now, the decisions have been that in some of the writer strikes that generative AI, you need to have a human author for it to meet copyright provisions. Could you talk
and
about
the Copyright Office has agreed as well that the AI itself can't have the copyright. I think that's right. That's consistent with how copyright works in other situations. There's kind of a famous case about a monkey selfie where I believe it was an orangutan got a hold of a camera and took a picture of themselves, and the question was who had the copyright in that. And the courts, I think, rightfully said that the monkey shouldn't have a copyright in it. Copyright isn't a system that was designed to reward. Copyright is a system that is designed to incentivize the creation of art for all the rest of us by giving an incentive to the artist. So giving that incentive to a system doesn't work, right? I mean, just all the way back to the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say copyright exists. The Constitution says in order to incentivize the creation of useful arts and sciences, we will create this system that gives essentially a form of a monopoly to the creator of something for a short period of time. If you try to apply that frame to a machine or a monkey, like that doesn't work. The monkey's not going to take more pictures because you give it the copyright, and neither is the AI. And so, there may be ways that we can think about what we want to do with these things, but I think copyright is a legal creation that doesn't really fit this situation, and we shouldn't try to jam it in because it's got a lot of pieces of it that are pretty inflexible that I think would be problematic.
And would similar ideas apply with patents or trademarks?
I think so. Again, I think these are all systems that were designed to help most of the, patents and trademarks and trade secrets and copyright are all systems that were designed to help protect creators in one form or another, and I just don't think that we need those incentives to apply to the machine systems, which are supposed to, I think, the best way to think about those is those are helping the creators, but nobody wants, you don't give the copyright to the brush, you give the copyright to the painter. And I think that these systems, as they're being used in the ways that I think they're being used, where these legal protections ought to come in, it's still right to think about the tool as a tool and not as a creator.
But conversely, so those systems are set up to protect creators, but how about liability, which is the other way around, where the public interest is quite different with liability.
Well, I think the public interest is largely the same for a lot of it, right? If you're putting prompts into a chat that creates something that's defamatory, I think you're responsible for that. So I actually think that for many of the liability questions, if the creator is creating something that's harming other people, the fact that they're using a tool to do it shouldn't change the liability story, right? That's not it. I think in instances where we're talking about creating harassing works or defamatory works or things that violate contract, if the creator is participating in that by driving the system, then they should have liability. I think there's a lot of efforts to want to put liability on the machine because there's more money there, but I think we should be very wary of doing that. First of all, I would like to see a lot more creators of machine learning systems and have it not be limited to just really rich companies or really rich people who can afford the liability. I think that's a bad outcome in terms of competition and developing kind of a garden of tools that are available. So I think we shouldn't base our liability decisions on who's got money. We should base our liability decisions on who's got responsibility. Now, that may mean that the creator, that may mean that the person who creates the system has some liability. That may mean that, I believe recently there was an airline had a chatbot that was offering people free flights because you could manipulate it. I think the company should have to stand behind those, even though the company probably created the AI that did that, or even if it was directly to the company as opposed to this instance where it was an airline. I think that, if you've got a system that's out there in the world defrauding people and doing things and doing things that harm people, then the person who creates the system should have liability as well. I just wouldn't parse it all of one or all of the other. You have to look at what's happened and who's responsible.
And with copyright, there's already been some decisions made. How about with liability? Is there anything that's evolved in the real world with that?
I don't know of very many cases that have gotten very far about liability in the kind of generative AI world. Now, sadly, in the context of, say, facial recognition and false arrests, or DNA analysis. There's a level of DNA analysis that uses machine learning. If you've got a situation which a whole bunch of DNA is in say, at a crime scene, there are machine learning tools that are trying to figure out the likelihood that a particular person was there, and those kinds of systems. And sadly, I don't see a lot of liability flowing in the way that it ought to, in terms of if these systems are poorly programmed and they result in miscarriages of justice. I think that they ought to be held liable. But the problem with that isn't the machine learning systems. That's the series of immunities that we've set up for official decision making, where we essentially immunize the police and government decision makers in a way that I think is really problematic. And there was some efforts in the Trump administration to try to say that if, say, a machine learning system resulted in you being discriminated against, you shouldn't be able to sue because it was the machine that did it. And EFF and a lot of organizations took a pretty strong stance that can't be the case, that a government agent making bad decisions shouldn't be able to hide behind a computer and immunize the whole thing. I don't think those regulations went through, but that's the thing to watch for. It's not just watching that we create liability in the correct places. It's making sure that we're ensuring that people who are using these kinds of systems remain accountable for the results of those decisions and how they impact people. And that's especially important in the context of government decision making. I think it was in Holland where they implemented a bad decision-making thing and kicked a whole bunch of people off of public support. This can end up in, not just people having bad information, but literally people losing the means to live. And so it's important that we don't let the use of a computer or a computer system create a field of immunity for either the creators or the users of that system. That's not right.
And you mentioned Holland. I did want to ask, what you've been saying, are there any significant, obvious differences between what's happening in different parts of the world around regulation for these things or law?
Well, right now, as we sit in February 2024, the Europeans are quite a ways ahead of the Americans in thinking about a legal regulatory structure. Those laws are still in the early days, but they've actually passed some rules, and they're beginning to develop some frameworks in the United States nationally. We have an executive order from the Biden administration. We have a thing called a blueprint for AI accountability. I don't think I got that name right. We have the Biden administration issued an executive order, and we've got other things happening at the national level, but none of them is rising to the level of an actual law around AI. There are many, many efforts in states across the country to pass statewide rules. California has very many of them. I think my colleague told me there was something around 1,300 proposed laws in the legislature. So there's lots of action to try to get ahead of things and regulate AI. But in the United States anyway, they haven't yet really become law, much less become implemented in a way that we can look at. On the European side, they do have some laws in place, but we're still in the early stages of implementing it. I think there is I think reasonable sense by lawmakers that they want to get out ahead of this, because I think they feel like maybe they were a little slow with earlier technologies. And that's good and bad. It's good if they're going to do careful things, but a lot of things we've seen have not been particularly careful and would be really problematic, either for free speech or for future innovation. And the one thing to watch for is, making sure that we don't create a set of rules that essentially make it impossible for anybody to compete with the current leaders in AI. They're already very large companies with a lot of money who have a head start on AI systems, and I think that could be very dangerous for all of us as users of those systems. And it's important that we continue to create opportunities for new entrants to come in and use the power of competition and markets to make sure that we don't get stuck with systems that don't serve us.
So how would that happen, that the laws would actually protect the major players now?
Well, one of the ways would be to make a rule that says you have to have a certain amount of money to cover any losses before you can release an AI system to the public, or a context of, a set of rules around how much testing and how much transparency and how many things you have to do before you can release an AI product. Now, I think it's okay to have a certain amount of transparency rules and other kinds of rules, but if you go too far in that direction, you create a situation in which only the big guys can afford to participate. You close out things like open models and open source models in AI. There's I think an interesting and good effort to try to think about public AI. All of those things need to have the space to breathe that a bad regulatory scheme or liability scheme could cut off their oxygen and leave us in a world where, love them or hate them, OpenAI, Google and Microsoft, and Facebook shouldn't be the only companies that
Baidu.
And Baidu, yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter. Today's tech giants shouldn't be the only ones that get to offer us AI tools, and we see this. There used to be a good cycle of innovation where one company looked like they controlled everything. There was a time when everybody thought IBM was the only company that could create things. I'm alive long enough to know that. And there's a cycle where somebody new comes along and they offer us a better deal and a better product, and we move to that. And then somebody else comes along and eats their lunch. And without functioning antitrust laws and smart regulation aimed at increasing competition rather than regulation that's captured by competition, that doesn't mean no regulation. It just means you have to be thoughtful about it. That we continue to create these situations where somebody new can come in and stand on the shoulders of whoever came before, but make something better for all of us, so that we, as the users of these tools and the next generation of developers of these tools, that we're in the driver's seat about what comes next. That's, it's a, again, that doesn't mean no regulation. I think sometimes, especially here in Silicon Valley, there's an idea that any regulation gets in the way. But we're living, there was a decision by the FCC that told AT&T, the monopolist at that time, that they had to let people plug something other than an AT&T phone into the wall. And the decision by the regulator to make a company let you plug something other than the phone into the wall is how we got home modems. It's how we got the internet generation. Now, that's smart regulation. That's not no regulation. No regulation would let AT&T do what they want, and they would have tied their phones and their control of the phone system into limiting or even eliminating the ability for us to have the internet at home. So I think that sometimes people get confused because sometimes government does the wrong thing, that the correct answer is for the government to do nothing. But that's not actually the world we live in, and that's not the world we enjoy. We have to have smart governance, and that governance has to include creating space for private industry to compete and innovate. Sorry, that's my little...
We have a Carter phone downstairs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's always funny to me because I like markets and I like those things, but the idea that they happen in some kind of other world where there's no regulatory framework, like that's just ahistorical. It's just not true. And unless we talk about it that way, we end up in a world where the big companies just get to write their own deal. When Sam Altman goes to Congress and says, please regulate us, you have to be very careful that you don't think that that's the end of the conversation, because if you look at the proposed regulation, they're a company. They're going in their self-interest. They're going to write proposed regulation that makes sure that they continue to win. And it's the role of all of us in talking to our lawmakers to make sure that the winners don't write the rules.
So that would be things like saying there should be a high liability limit, or that you need, essentially something like regulation for medical devices or something like that.
You can do stuff like that. You can also say that certain big players have to meet a certain set of rules that little players don't. We do that in employment all the time. If you have less than 3 employees, you don't have to do some. Once you reach 100 employees, you have to do a little more. So you could create some kind of a staged regulatory system. That's one way to deal with it. You could talk about antitrust, like you don't let these companies just continue to buy each other. This is something that we've seen in, say, the platform space or in other tech spaces where the mergers and acquisitions have resulted in less and less options and choice for us as companies get sucked up and then features get turned off or things like that. So, it's not a new set of tools that we need for these, AI systems. We may need some new thinking about what transparency looks like and what accountability looks like because the systems are different. But a lot of our old tools, preventing fraud, preventing defamation, preventing, don't mislead people, those kinds of rules will serve us well if we're thoughtful about how we apply them in this somewhat new context.
So I'll ask you that. So generative AI is supremely good at kind of pattern matching.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the implications for surveillance, forensics? Presumably, people will be able to find like transactions from decades ago that fit a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there could be both positive and negative effects.
Sure. Look, the phone companies have been using versions of machine learning to try to find the people who are cheating, on phone calls for a long, long time. And so have a lot of other big businesses. They've been running big data, their data through systems that try to figure out about fraud and other kinds of things, and also inefficiencies. I think, AI systems are great internally to somebody who has a lot of data and they're trying to figure out what they know about it from those kinds of things. When I think about AI systems, I kind of ask 2 big questions. One is, who is the system serving? And if it's serving you and it's your system, there's a whole lot of space for a lot of cool things to happen. But if it's tracking you, but serving someone else, whether that's the cops or somebody who's trying to decide how much you pay for things or whether you qualify for a loan, that's an area where we have to look a little closer and see how things are doing. So who is it serving and who bears the cost if it's wrong? Again, if you type something into a chatbot and you get gibberish back, okay, you got to try again. You might have to write your own essay. You bear the downside if it's wrong. But if a machine learning system decides whether you get out of jail or not, if it's wrong, the judge isn't the one who pays. You're the one who pays. A system that decides whether your children are going to get to stay with you or not. These are all systems that are in place now, being used by governments across the country. A system that decides whether you get to keep your children or not based upon the history of your interactions with the police around your children. If that system's wrong, you bear the cost, not the county that's running that system. That's another place where we really need to stop and interrogate. And you can, if you apply those two questions to machine learning systems, I think you can get a pretty good starter framework for where we should focus our attention and our regulation, and where, we should do less. And again, I know people who are training up AIs now to try to help them figure out their own systems. There's a lot of people using them in the context of, say, their health or other kinds of things. Those systems can be really helpful. They can be really helpful to a company who's trying to figure out, where are we falling down on the job in terms of our sales. Those are all really reasonable. And again, I think it can be a really powerful and cool tool for doing a lot of these kinds of things. But to me, if we start with the question, who bears the cost if it's wrong and who is it serving, then we can begin to figure out where the danger zones are.
And you didn't mention predictive policing, but
Sure.
when you talk about like the things for whether someone should be paroled or family court kind of things, it makes me think of that.
Yes.
And I assume they are sort of in the same basket, right?
Yeah, predictive policing is a context in which the people who get impacted by the decisions of the system, which are the people who get arrested or harassed by the cops, are not the people who are controlling the system. So the consequences go to the wrong person, and the system is not serving the people who are being judged. It's serving the cops. Predictive policing has another problem, which is something that's really always important to think about with AI systems, because predictive policing is not predicting crime. It's predicting what the police are going to do. And we know this because that's what it's trained on. Most predictive policing systems are trained based on what the cops do every day and the cops' priorities, and they spit back out things that are based on the cops' priorities. Well, we all know, we live in this world, the police don't see all the crime. They don't participate in all the crime. There are certain neighborhoods and certain communities who are over-policed and some who are under-policed. What we have seen with these systems is that they double down on whatever biases the police have. So this is a situation in which it's not only important to look at how the system's working, but what is it being trained on? And predictive policing is one where it's pretty easy to see. Predictive policing is one where it's pretty easy to see that what is being trained on is not what it's being used for. And that creates problems, and it creates very specific and biased problems for certain communities and certain people.
And predictive policing goes back to IBM in the 60s.
Sure.
But I mean, how, and there's a current generation, but is generative AI, and specifically chatbots, changing these, let's say, three areas? So the family court, parole, predictive policing, are you already seeing either a real impact or people changing the way that they're planning or laws around it, or is it still in the future?
I think that the systems that are in the large language models are kind of a different stripe than the systems that are going to things like law enforcement and predictive policing and those kinds of things. Because the data that they want to train on are quite different. And so in the context, say, of predictive policing, they're training on what the cops do. They don't want all the stuff that's in the large language models, which might include stuff like TV shows and books and movies and other kinds of things that aren't actually about policing. So we haven't yet seen a lot of crossover. I suspect at some point we will, because we're in a time where people are wanting to apply large language models to every problem. But I haven't seen that yet. And I think it's something we really need to watch out for. Large language models are about language, right? They're about how to, they're not systems that are good at doing kind of very specific thing based on very specific information. by design, they're much broader.
But sorry, I think I'm thinking partly of as an interface to, have you seen, are people already, that I would assume will come, where, you can ask plain English queries about, the future of someone, should they be paroled or should.
I suspect so. Really. I suspect so, but I think that, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what the latest, I wouldn't surprise me. I've seen some stuff that's been marketed to cops that allows them to do plain language kinds of things. Certainly, things, facial recognition stuff lets them upload pictures and then get pictures back in a very simple frame UI. And, that's problematic. There was even somebody who, uploaded a drawing, and they tried to use that to use the facial recognition. There was one horrible story where they uploaded a victim said that the person looked like Woody Harrelson, so they uploaded a picture of Woody Harrelson, and then the cops tried to, basically arrest and harass people based upon, not about whether they'd done the crime or anything, but about whether the system matched them as looking a lot like Woody Harrelson. I mean, this is just bad police work. It's dangerous and it's scary, and it would be funny if it wasn't horrific, right? The consequences of getting yourself, the consequences of getting arrested in our society right now are not small. And they can end your job, they can end your life, they can end your custody of your kids, even if you're cleared later. So it's really important, especially in the context of police, that we're very careful about knowing the difference between what the machine is telling you and what actual evidence is and what actual police work is. And all too often we see cops taking shortcuts where they think that because the machine brought up somebody's picture that they have probable cause to go out and arrest them. And I'm hopeful that we will work at EFF to make sure that a facial recognition match doesn't constitute probable cause for purposes of an arrest warrant.
I read about they predicted what someone looked like based on DNA, and then
yes, they tried to grow like a picture based on DNA. I mean, these systems, I don't know, I appreciate science fiction, but I think sometimes people really do misunderstand the big gap between how things work on TV and how they work in real life. And I think that we have to be wary of shortcuts around old-fashioned policing. You shouldn't be able to just sit behind a computer and solve crimes. In most of the cases, you actually have to go out into the neighborhood, do real police work, investigate, talk to witnesses, do the real work.
So what most excites you about chatbots and this technology moving into the future?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that are exciting about this. I think that, as a tool to help people shortcut things that are monotonous and not fun to do, that's what technology is great at, and we should have that. We shouldn't have to fill out the same form 20 times, whether we're dealing with our doctors or are dealing with chatbots can help really save time. And they also are far more user-friendly. The user experience for a chatbot can be really great. I think they're also fun. You can have a lot of fun with these kinds of things. And that's great. I got an invitation to an event that somebody had, written in, iambic pentameter. It was cool. It was funny. It was a lot funnier than if we did just, you could do that yourself too. But I think as an aid to help people, as a first draft machine that helps people, especially people who have a hard time kind of putting pen to paper to generate a first draft that then you can edit. There are many of us, and I'm one of them, who are better editors than we are writers, helping people get over that first hump so that they have a draft that they can work off of. That can be very helpful. A lot of us are drowning in email right now, and a lot of email responses don't require a lot of intelligence. I think having an interface that helps make those kinds of things happen when, you're invited to an event and it checks your calendar, decides you can do it, you can't do it, you can, and responds back and negotiates that for people. That's just one example that that comes to mind. I think there are lots of, rote things that it would be great to have some of these assisted technologies help us do better. And the other piece of this, and assisted technologies is really important, these systems can be very helpful for people who need assistive technologies of one kind or another. I have a podcast called How to Fix the Internet. We just spoke with a woman who is blind, who works for the New York Public Library, who was talking about how great some of these AI-generated assistive technologies are to help her navigate the world more, to help her understand what's in a photo better. As she points out, you have to be careful because it might not be right, but you can get a much richer description of the world around you with an AI-assisted technology than, say, just simply people putting tags into photos or maps or other kinds of things. So I think especially for people who need various kinds of assisted technologies, the chatbot interfaces, as they're going to, and I hope, develop more to serve these communities, can really offer a much richer experience of lots of pieces of our world.
And chatbots, generative AI in general is making, photographs are no longer evidence of things. Video. What are the sort of legal implications that anything can be generated?
Well, I think we have always had to deal in the world of evidence with fakes. I remember reports of Photoshop and how scary that was going to be for evidence purposes. I think as society we develop tolerances and understandings about the difference between real and fake that will evolve over time, and we evolve indicia of whether something is trustworthy or not, and we're going to continue to evolve those things. My grandmother's generation listened to a radio show by Orson Welles called War of the Worlds and thought Mars was invading, and by the time I came along, people wouldn't fall for that anymore. And I think if you watch kids today, they often have a much better sense of things that are fake online and much more skepticism of things that are fake online than their parents' generation, and that's going to continue. Sadly, I don't think watermarks are really going to be a good answer for a lot of things. I know a lot of people would like to see watermarks as a way to tell something real from something not real. On the security side, from EFF, I will tell you that most of the hackers I know are going to be pretty good at taking watermarks off things or putting fake watermarks on things. So that might be able to help at a low level, but for higher levels, we're going to have to develop more systems that help us tell the truth, but we've always had to do that. The rules, what I can present in a court of law and what I have to do to authenticate it is very different than putting something up on the internet. And the law may have to develop more things as well to develop a set of evidentiary principles that are consistent with the fact that some things might be fake. But this is something that society has always had to do at one level or another, and I think that we will continue to do it.
So watermarks are a technical solution, but
Correct.
What about simple legal requirements that chatbot output not be misrepresented as human or something?
Sure. I think that there are things that we could do that. I think that they get tricky along the edges, right? I think people want bots to do things for them. Many people use a little bot to post on social media because that little bot will go and post on multiple social medias for you. You do the thinking and then it sends it out. There are a lot of things that we've talked about inauthentic content or bot-generated content that will fall afoul of that. I don't think that's what we're aiming at. So I think it's important that we think about, we need to write the rules around this carefully because I think we are going to want to use bots to do things for us. So simply saying you can't do it if a bot does it, I think is going to be self-defeating for society. I don't think it's going to work.
But how about just labeling it as such?
I think a label is possible. I think labels are easy to take off.
Right, if someone wants to deceive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of truth in advertising stuff could be helpful, especially, again, in the context of advertising and commercial transactions. There's a long history of requiring people to, put a label on it that tells you where it came from and what are the ingredients, and those kinds of things have been upheld. So I think those kinds of things, we'll start to see those kinds of requirements applied in the context of commercial transactions first, and especially around food and other things where it could be very damaging. But I don't know that as a rule for the rest of society, it makes a lot of sense. We have to start thinking about, what does transparency look like, and what does fraud look like. I actually think accountability for fraud on the back end is a really important tool, and often we kind of overlook that as a way to create the right incentives, that if you get defrauded by something, you should be able to sue. You should be able to hold people criminally responsible. Fraud is a criminal and civil thing. So I think both thinking about what can we do on the front end to try to help protect people, but also what we can do on the back end to help people who have been harmed. We have to think on both sides of that.
So you mean if chatbots are used to commit fraud, that there be a clearer path to...
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. There should be a clear trail. You could be able to demand to see, how did this happen, and accountability for it happening.
What is you've talked about some, but what's your greatest fear about the way chatbots can evolve?
Well, I think my greatest fear is that humans won't develop the level of skepticism about what's going on with chatbots that they need. And I think that that worry is already manifest in a lot of places. And so I think that we need to work as humans to make sure that we are bringing a degree of skepticism to the information that we're getting with chatbots. There is a well-known bias, that if a computer gives you information, people have bias towards believing it. I don't think that's been a very good bias for a long time, and I think we should get even more skeptical even as we put pressure on the companies to get rid of, to make that situation as rare as possible. There are plenty of things we can do to reduce the incidence of that, but I don't think we can eliminate it entirely, and so we gotta be sharper as humans.
So if you could create your own chatbot, what would it be like, or what would it do?
I just interviewed a woman named Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister for Taiwan, and Audrey told me that she has trained up a chatbot to facilitate a meeting in the style of Audrey Tang. And that's because, she lives a very open source life. All the meetings that she has, many, many meetings that she has facilitated have public record of them. They're recorded, they're available. She trained up an AI so that she can have an AI run and facilitate a meeting in her style. And that, it doesn't mean she's not there, but it means she gets to kind of set aside some of the administrative overhead of facilitating a meeting and really be present. And I have to admit, as somebody who facilitates a lot of meetings, that sounded awesome to me. I also think a chatbot that helps me do the things that I want to do better, and a lot of that involves scheduling and responding to email and making sure that I'm not missing events and getting to things on time, and all of those sorts of things is something that I would love to have an assistant help me with. So I think those are two of them. I think the other thing to remember about chatbots, because as long as I'm here and I'm with EFF and we're a privacy organization, is what you tell chatbots isn't private, unless you've really developed. Right now, there are romantic chatbots. They're not private. There are all of the big publicly available chatbot systems are not private. And I think that they create the idea that they're private because it's just you and your computer. But it's important that we think about what information we share and where we're sharing it in these kinds of situations, so that we're not surprised later that some information you gave to a chatbot in confidence ends up being used to discriminate against you when you want a job. Right now, it goes into a lot of these things. They go into a huge corpus and then just get spit out back randomly. But they can't promise us, nor is it true, that it's never going to get spit back out verbatim. So in this world, it's just important that people realize that your conversations, even if they feel intimate and private, are not. And that people think about their privacy. Not only, and I want to be really clear about this, I don't think that this is something that people individually should have to deal with. We need rules and laws. We talked about regulation. We need to protect people's privacy in their interactions with AI systems. And we need to put rules and limits around what they can ask you for and what they can do with the information that they have, and transparency about that. I think it's really important that we extend that we need privacy in the rest of our world right now deeply, and we need it in the world of AI as well.
That is also an impediment to businesses using AI. I know that nobody, private or a business, wants to put all their confidential stuff essentially into the public domain to use it.
Yep.
Do you see is there a legal solution that would help both of those to make?
Well, yeah, I think a basic privacy law would do that. Right now, for instance, we have a very strong privacy law around your voice. We have a wiretapping act that requires consent. In California, we require two-party consent before you can wiretap someone. We do not have something around your face. That's why facial recognition companies were able to scrape faces from all over the internet and turn them into systems that the cops can use and that private parties can use. But you don't have voice systems that do that. And you don't have voice systems to do that because of the Wiretap Act protections. So yeah, we could make protections. We could have systems that say, look, your chatbot inputs can be private, that they get to use them for one purpose and not other purposes. They get to use them for purposes of answering your question, but they don't get to use it to train their model. Could do that. In fact, I think there are people who are trying to begin to offer those kinds of systems. And this is what a lot of the companies do. They buy a model, and then they input their systems into it. So the model gets trained up on a lot of other things, but then the company uses it, and it doesn't go back out again, right? The data doesn't go back out to the big system once the model has been licensed to the company. I mean, again, I'm not a business person, but I think that's how that works. Well, that could happen for us too.
But I mean, how would that works for companies that can buy an entire model, but you or I can't necessarily.
But the law could make it so that was a thing that we had, right? You could limit what they could train their models off of to things where they have consent, informed, real consent to train the models. Many people would probably still be willing to do that, but that's not what's happening now. I mean, right now, I believe Reddit just sold a huge chunk of its forums to an AI company to train up the thing. The Redditors, the people who were doing that, and many of those conversations, they can be silly and whatever, but they can also be very intimate. Like that, I think that's not okay. I mean, as a legal matter, does it belong to Reddit and you knew that because you clicked the thing? Yeah, that's true. As an ethical matter or as a matter for the people who are engaging in those conversations, they should have the option to decide whether their private conversations over the Reddit forum are, or even, group conversations, but a closed group or a group, there are Reddit conversations that deal with alcoholism, that deal with drug abuse, that deal with violence in families, that deal with all sorts of things. I think that we need a set of rules that make it very clear to you and me in the context in which we're giving information that we get the ability to decide whether that's going to be used to train an AI or not. And we can build those systems.
Is EFF or anyone else proposing such thing?
At this point, no. Right now, we're largely trying to bat away bad ideas. I think that actually the European Union's privacy rules will probably ultimately come there. They need some work. I think that they're the first generation of privacy rules. I think you'll see the California Consumer Privacy Organization begin to address this kind of stuff sooner. Do we have any? I think we have some sectoral stuff that we have supported along these lines, but not a broad law, because it's kind of early days.
And how about the other, Jaron Lanier and others have proposed that potentially people could get some sort of compensation, if I understand, for the use of their data.
I will say that I don't believe in pay to play for those situations, because I think that ends up meaning that rich people get privacy and poor people don't. I don't believe poor privacy for poor people ought to be our mantra. But what's going to happen is people who need the money are going to sell off their data, and the people who don't need the money are going to say, no, I won't sell off my data. And I don't think that's how we should think about privacy. We don't think about speech that way. We don't think about other hard things that way, things that are hard things. We don't think about rights that way. And I think introducing a financial incentive for people to violate their own privacy is a bad policy.
But couldn't it be done the other way around, where people automatically get paid if it's used, regardless of whether they opt in or out?
I don't think that's going to solve the problem. You're not going to have any privacy. I don't want my heartfelt conversations about abuse in my family that I shared on Reddit, like the fact that I get some pennies for them, it's just orthogonal to the problem, right? I don't think that money is a substitute for rights. I think rights exist, and they need to be protected, and your privacy right and it needs to be protected regardless. So yeah, there have been versions of this for all sorts of things, and the data dividend is one of them that Gavin Newsom liked for a while before. This idea that because our data is being used by Google to do blah blah blah, we should get money back, and I think that that's wrongheaded. Again, I think that it's actually very inequitable when you kind of get down to how it works. It either misunderstands that there are poor people in the world and assumes everybody's rich, or it's trying to put a monetary value on something that shouldn't be a monetary thing. We all have free speech. We should all be able to stand in the public square and say what we think. It is the case that people who own newspapers can have a bigger voice than the rest of us, but the right doesn't turn on that.
And that leads into kind of the business model.
And don't get me started about Jaron Lanier in Section 230. The man should really stick with the things that he knows about and stay away from the law, because he doesn't understand how Section 230 works. And it's sad to me that he went into Wired magazine and basically fundamentally misunderstood the law. So anyway, that's a whole other thing. He thinks that the surveillance business model is due to Section 230. It's not.
Oh, surveillance capitalism or selling data.
Well, right. It doesn't have anything to do with secondary liability for what speakers say, which is what Section 230 is about.
Right. No. Yeah, I'll ask you about
There's a Wired editorial
that
they should be embarrassed. They should have had fact checkers. Like, they shouldn't have run that. Anyway.
Huh.
I think because Jaron Lanier's a famous guy, everybody assumes that what he's right, and they don't double check what he's saying. And he might be right about AR and VR. I don't know enough about that world, but I know about Section 230, and he's not right. And he shouldn't be given that platform for something he knows nothing about.
Because what was interesting, it reminds me a little bit. He did talk, if I'm remembering right, about people getting paid for some of their data, the data dignity thing.
Yeah.
That you should get paid, which sort of echoes like Ted Nelson with micropayments. I mean, there's a lot of examples where people don't get paid for reuse of their material. If there is a way to do that, I've always thought that's somewhat interesting, but is that separate from what you're saying he misunderstood, or
That's separate from what he misunderstood, because
Okay.
Section 230 is
Yeah, yeah.
just a whole other
Well,
thing.
it's just
It's a
that the
secondary liability scheme.
Facebook's not responsible for the content that
Right.
flows over its
So
wires.
there's nothing
Yeah.
about that has anything to do with it. I think that the truth is, the scale at which data is valuable to somebody like Google means that there is not very much money for the individual who puts their data here. It's a kind of a misunderstanding of the math to think that Google makes 0.001 of a penny off of the time that you say you're searching for shoes. Like, that's not really, it's just kind of a misunderstanding. The data is valuable to Google at scale. And it's only valuable to Google at scale. So even if you went to all the math to figure out how much your data was worth to Google, like, that would make class action settlements where you get 0.01 penny look generous. That's not how it works. And I think that it's just I don't know. I don't want to characterize it other than wrong and not helpful. I think that if we don't like the surveillance business model, we should just ban it. We can. We don't let people sell themselves into slavery. We do all sorts of things that we don't, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic example, but like we can just ban the surveillance business model. We could just say you can't do that.
And GDPR does not go as far as
No,
to ban it by any
GDPR
means.
is mainly about notice, and a lot of clicking through of things, which it's not bad. I think GDPR though is an example of a law that created a lot of work for companies, including nonprofits like EFF. Like, GDPR compliance was a huge cost to us. It meant that a lot of private companies that helped people manage their data went out of business, because then it all went to Amazon, because Amazon was GDPR compliant. This is a situation in which you've got to look at what are the consequences of the regulatory structure, and I think that I may be wrong, and it would be good for somebody to do real research into this, but my sense on the ground is that the GDPR compliance regime resulted in a significant decrease in competition for people who were hosting that kind of data, and a significant windfall for Amazon.
So that's your fear with AI, that you could get the same pushing only to large players.
Correct.
Could you talk a little bit about how the business models are evolving with generative AI? I mean, obviously we've seen subscription come back in a way that it hasn't really for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But do you see things happening now that are...
Not yet, but I admit I'm not really on the business side. There's probably people who watch on the business side who could tell you. That's not where I sit in the world. I do think, it's interesting that OpenAI went with a subscription model for things. I think personal agents are going to become a thing. And then it's really important to look at what are the privacy things, and what are you actually getting more than you're giving with those kinds of things. But you could build one that isn't. I mean, once the models are built up and trained, every single bit of data that is input into it doesn't necessarily need to go into the big training anymore, right?
And sort of, let's see, tell me whether you want me to ask you about the more apocalyptic fears, extinction, and all of that.
I mean, I think that from my perspective, we have a lot of problems with the way AI systems are being used today. And we have to be very careful that we don't let the science fiction, scary future stories take our eyes off the ball of what's going on today. And I worry that has happened a lot, that a lot of the people who are really upset about a future AI apocalypse let me say this differently. I think that the fears of an AI apocalypse are generating more attention than they merit at this point in time, and the actual consequences of AI systems being deployed on marginalized communities in the context of foster care and policing and government benefits and even private systems that are deciding whether you get a loan or whether you get a job or any of those kinds of evaluating people's resumes. Those problems exist today, and I think that it's wrong as a society for us to focus on future kind of abstract ideas and at the expense of things that are happening today. I'm not. I think that's my biggest concern. I think that there's a possibility that there is an AI apocalyptic future, but I think we have a lot of road between here and there. I mean, I think that just the trajectory of generative AI systems when they were first announced a little over a year or so ago, when they were first released and suddenly everybody thought they were going to take over the whole world. It's a year later and we're all exchanging situations in which they gave us completely garbage answers, right? Lawyers are getting sanctioned because they cited non-existent cases. Like, we're all learning in real time that maybe they're not magic, and we have to be skeptical of them. I think if you look forward to the set of things that have to happen before we get to an AI apocalypse, there's a lot more of those moments. However, people are losing their homes, people are losing their jobs, biases in systems are getting doubled down on, the wrong people are getting arrested, decisions about parole, people's decisions about public benefits, those are all happening right now. And I worry, and I think it's fair to say to the people who are raising these concerns, maybe it's time to worry a little bit about the people who aren't you and the impact of these systems on marginalized communities and communities that aren't sitting at the top of our society. And if we can solve their problems, maybe that'll help us avoid the AI future, because otherwise, I don't think we're going to, I don't know. That's it. That's all I have to say. The way that the top of the food chain in Silicon Valley controls the conversations can be very problematic for the rest of us who are living in a world in which AI and machine learning systems are already making decisions that they shouldn't.
So, one of the things we're bringing up in the exhibit is that it's great marketing. I mean, it's like, this is so dangerous, it's like nuclear weapons, but it can help you tomorrow with your essay.
Right. It's just
double.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, yeah.
And so the last, do you want to say something about misinformation, disinformation, given we're going into an election year?
I mean, I think it's important that people be on the lookout for misinformation and disinformation. These systems are definitely going to be used to try to turbocharge those systems that already exist to put out misinformation and disinformation. I think it is a bit of a mistake to think that the ability to spread a lie turns on whether the AI is convincing or not. I think we're living in a time where the things that make misinformation and disinformation powerful are the powerful forces behind them, not whether the image is believable. And there are a lot of people in our society right now who think that the presidential election was stolen. That's not because of AI systems. That's because their leaders are telling them that. I think that's a bigger problem, honestly, than whether the images are believable or not. We all, the ability to interpret images in a way that serves your political purpose is a very, very powerful force, and it really doesn't turn on the image. It turns on the power.
But how would there be any legal way to protect, let's say, if millions of people have a relationship with something like Replica, which then sort of just subtly puts in some hints toward a particular political point of view or product or whatever. Is there even any legal basis you could?
Well, no. I mean, William Randolph Hearst started a war. Like the idea that our media has a point of view and they're trying to point us in that way is something that if you haven't figured out at this point, you should know. Every media, even if they try to be balanced, and many media tries to be balanced and give both sides of the story, they still have a point of view. Jeff Jarvis calls it the view from nowhere. Like, that doesn't exist. So, that was the plot of, was it Kevin Spacey? That's been the plot of a bunch of, it doesn't have to be the plot of movies. It's actually true. We have media platforms that have tried to steer people towards one candidate or another. Technology isn't going to fix that, nor is it going to make it significantly worse. I think we have to, if there is an image that is a lie, if people are defrauded, we need to use our laws against fraud. We need to use our laws against defamation and misleading people. They all exist. You don't need a new set of laws for that. But I don't think that the technology creates a brand new problem, and I don't even think it supercharges the current problem all that much. And I say that from kind of a sad position, which is we had live coverage of an invasion of the U.S. Capitol that everybody in the country was able to see, and we still have a huge disagreement in our society about what happened. So I think that I don't think this is a new problem. I think that, and again, I think that for a lot of misinformation and disinformation, the problem is because leaders are telling people to interpret facts in a particular way. There was a very bad image of Nancy Pelosi that was doctored. Everybody knew it was, it was clearly doctored. People figured it out right away. 'Twas ever so, I guess. I'm a little like Ecclesiastes on this, right? There is nothing new under the sun. We're going to have all the same problems. Technology is not going to fix any of these problems. I don't actually think it's creating new ones either, in any significant way. That doesn't mean we don't have to address them. We do. But I think there's a lot of people who would like to blame the technology because it's easier than blaming what's going on in our society and some of the people involved in our society.
And the last thing I wanted to ask about is we're covering in the exhibit how AI is to some extent people, like Soylent Green is people. And
right.
We're talking about the click workers and taskers in various parts of the world that are doing this mind-numbing work. And we have a section on the future of work. But is there any particular, kind of from a civil liberties legal point of view, are there any, and we are covering the strike,
right.
But any particular issues that come to mind that are really different with chatbots or that we need to think about with them?
Well, I do think it's an important point that a lot of these AI systems and chatbots in particular are kind of sock puppets. All the way back to Eliza. We have seen, this is a point Cory Doctorow makes, right? First of all, a lot of this isn't technology. A lot of it is people, and a lot of it is an attempt to try to cover the people up with technology so we don't know that there are people behind the curtain. It's a lot of, great and powerful Oz kind of storytelling. So I think that's really important. I also think that recognizing that labor as labor and treating it as real labor that, is treated fairly and has all the protections of labor, those are important issues. I think that, the use of technology, that again, I think that in the context of employment, paying attention to the ways in which these systems can turbocharge discrimination and bias, and those kinds of things are really important. But that is taking old doctrines and old protections and making sure they apply in this new context and not getting kind of distracted by the technology that we lose track of the values of treating people with respect and recognizing that their work is work and not outsourcing and gigifying what ought to be a real job.
Anything else that?
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I asked my colleagues what I should say, and I'm trying to make sure that I hit everything that they hit. The other thing that I think that we have tried to think about at EFF is that a lot of these systems are being deployed, especially again by governments, but even by companies without a lot of public knowledge or input. And I think one of the things we ought to demand is transparency when AI and machine learning systems are involved in decisions that affect us. And again, that includes the public ones like policing and facial recognition systems and foster care and things like that, where we really do need our we really do need our processes by which we develop new rules. The Administrative Procedures Act has rulemakings where people have a chance to have input and all of that. If we're using a computer system to make the rules, we should have the same public input processes. And that's an issue that EFF is really trying to get a hold of, because often we discover that governments or companies are using these systems far after the fact. And it's hard to do something after the fact. So we need to really shift our focus to creating, and this is something in the regulatory context as well, to creating systems of knowledge and public input before these systems get deployed, rather than forcing us to figure out afterwards. And if I could, I don't know, and it's probably not timely because you can do this in October, but San Francisco has this Proposition E right now that would give the cops a year to deploy new surveillance and drones and other kinds of systems before they even have to tell the public that that's what they've done, to work out the kinks. That's exactly the opposite of how these things should happen. The public should have knowledge, awareness, and the ability to weigh in about whether we want these kinds of systems controlling us before they get deployed. And, at EFF, we're working on legal ways to try to make that happen. But that's something that I think the public can and should demand from their lawmakers, that we should not be the test subjects for these systems. That's a little important in the context of chatbots. It's really important in the context of police decision making, and there's a continuum along the way there.